In the early morning light, an elderly Palestinian woman sits in her garden holding a rusted key. It's the key to a home her family was forced to leave decades ago, one of countless similar keys kept by displaced Palestinians, symbols of homes they can never return to. The story of Palestine's transformation isn't a simple tale. It's a complex narrative stretching across more than a century, marked by colonial ambitions, competing nationalist movements, and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. Let's turn back the pages of history to the late 1800s. Palestine was then part of the Ottoman Empire, home to a population that was approximately 87% Arab and 3% Jewish, living together in relative peace. The land was predominantly rural, dotted with ancient olive groves and small farming communities that had existed for generations. But changes were brewing. In Europe, a movement called Zionism was gaining momentum, advocating for the establishment of a Jewish homeland. The British Empire, seeing an opportunity to extend its influence, issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, promising support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This declaration was made without consulting the Palestinian Arabs, who made up the vast majority of the population. It was a promise made by one people to another about a land that belonged to neither. As Jewish immigration increased in the 1920s and 1930s, tensions grew. Palestinian farmers began seeing their lands purchased by European Jewish organizations, often from absent landlords who lived in cities like Beirut or Damascus. Many Palestinian tenant farmers found themselves evicted from lands their families had worked for generations. The British Mandate period was marked by increasing conflict. Palestinian Arabs, seeing their majority status threatened, launched protests and revolts. The Great Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 was met with harsh British suppression, weakening Palestinian society just before its greatest challenge. What followed in 1948 was what Israelis call their War of Independence, and what Palestinians remember as the Nakba, the catastrophe. During this period, over 750,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes. More than 400 Palestinian villages were destroyed or repopulated with Jewish immigrants. The scene repeats in old photographs and testimonies, families grabbing what they could carry, leaving behind their farms, their shops, their schools, their entire lives. Many took their house keys with them, believing they would return in a few weeks once the fighting died down. Those keys remain with their descendants today, passed down like precious heirlooms. Those keys remain with their descendants today, passed down like precious heirlooms. The displacement didn't end in 1948. The 1967 Six-Day War saw Israel occupy the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, leading to another wave of Palestinian refugees. Settlements began appearing in occupied territories, gradually expanding despite international law considering them illegal. The landscape began to change dramatically. Ancient olive groves were uprooted to make way for new construction. Wells were deepened, diverting water resources. A complex system of checkpoints, permits, and barriers fragmented Palestinian communities. A complex system of checkpoints, permits, and barriers fragmented Palestinian communities. In the West Bank today, the separation wall snakes through the landscape, ostensibly for security, but effectively annexing more Palestinian land. Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem face demolition orders, while new settlements continue to expand. In Gaza, decades of blockade have created what many call the world's largest open-air prison. The story continues with the steady erosion of Palestinian space and rights. Farmers must watch as their lands are declared closed military zones or nature reserves. Children must pass through checkpoints just to reach their schools. Families are separated by a maze of administrative categories and permits. The process is often subtle. a new road that Palestinians aren't allowed to use, a spring declared off limits, grazing lands suddenly becoming a closed military zone. It's a slow motion dispossession that continues day by day, year by year. Grazing lands suddenly becoming a closed military zone. It's a slow motion dispossession that continues day by day, year by year. Yet Palestinians persist in their connection to the land. In refugee camps across the Middle East, grandparents pass down memories of their villages to children who have never seen them. In the West Bank, farmers still plant olive trees even when they know they might be uprooted. In Gaza, despite the rubble of repeated bombardments, people rebuild. The story of Palestine is written in the landscape itself, in the ruins of villages hidden in Israeli forests, in the contrast between new settlements and crowded refugee camps, in the walls and checkpoints that divide the land, in the ancient olive trees that still stand as witnesses to history. In the ancient olive trees that still stand as witnesses to history. It's a story that continues to unfold. Every new settlement expansion, every house demolition, every acre declared off limits to Palestinians adds another chapter. The elderly woman with her rusted key represents millions who still dream of return, who still hold on to their rights and their memories. This is not just a story of the past, but of the present. As we speak, more Palestinian land is being claimed for settlements. More homes face demolition orders. More families face displacement. The process that began over a century ago continues today, reshaping the physical and human geography of Palestine. The transformation of Palestine represents one of the most dramatic examples of territorial displacement in modern history. It's a story of how a homeland can be gradually unmade, how a people can find themselves increasingly constrained in their own land, how the map can be redrawn not just with armies, but with bureaucracies, permits, and planning laws. As the sun sets over Jerusalem, the elderly woman places the key back in its special place. It may never open her old family home again, but it opens something else, the memory of what was lost and the hope for what might yet be restored. The story of Palestine's transformation continues to be written, not just in history books, but in the daily lives of millions of Palestinians who still struggle to hold on to what remains of their homeland.